It is March 1945. The war in Europe is in its brutal final stage. The Allied armies have driven the Germans back to their final, massive obstacle, the Rhine River. The air is razor cold and thick with a dense fog that clings to the ground along the German bank of the Rhine River. In the dead of night, in a clearing near the city of Viersen, the ground begins to vibrate. The sounds are massive, metallic, and undeniable. This is the sound of an army. The low, heavy growl of Sherman tanks grinding their footprints over frozen mud. The roar of truck convoys shifting gears as they bring artillery into position. And the steady, repetitive clanking of construction as engineers prepare bridging equipment. It is the unmistakable sound of 30,000 men of two full American divisions staging for the final bloody push into the heart of Germany. German reconnaissance pilots have flown over the site. German radio monitors have tracked the chatter. Their artillery officers are zeroing their sights. Every piece of intelligence confirms it. This is the main event. This is where the 9th U.S. Army will attempt its massive breakthrough. The German response is immediate and absolute. Their best reserves, their heavy armor, and their concentrated artillery are diverted to Viersen. They are lined up, waiting to destroy the greatest American threat they can see. But what the German high command and radio operators do not know is that they are staring at an army that does not exist. The tank treads are a sound effect, broadcast through a massive speaker array. The supply convoy is 200 trucks driven by men who were, until recently, painting commercial billboards in New York. And those 33-ton Sherman tanks that German intelligence reports seeing? They are 6 feet tall, made of inflatable rubber and canvas, and weigh less than 100 pounds. The impossible act is complete. These men, whom the military would have once rejected for being too soft, too artistic, too theatrical, have just committed the unthinkable. They have used the power of imagination, the fatal flaw of the artist, to stop an army of hardened soldiers. And they did it without firing a single shot. This impossible act of strategic misdirection was a bloodless victory that saved thousands of lives, and it became the masterpiece of a unit officially known only as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The very creation of the 23rd was an acknowledgement that victory would require more than just firepower. It would require theatrical genius. Their existence was a radical experiment in military strategy. Their official roster was an anomaly, a gathering of American creative talent pulled directly from art schools, commercial ad agencies, film studios, and Broadway theater groups. In an army built on rigid military standards, these men's skills were considered their fatal flaw. They were painters, architects, set designers, costume makers, and actors, not infantry. General Eisenhower's staff, seeing the list of recruits, wryly noted that the unit's complement was more theatrical than military. Yet this concentration of creative genius was the weapon. This unit was a pre-war cultural snapshot of America's most imaginative minds. Their ranks included individuals who would later define post-war culture. The likes of abstract expressionist painter Ellsworth Kelly, renowned photographer Art Kane, and the future titan of American fashion, designer Bill Blass. But before they designed masterpieces in paint and silk, their work was camouflage and canvas. This reliance on illusion was born of a brutal, unsustainable reality on the front lines. The creativity the Allies could no longer ignore because as the war pushed past Normandy, the tone shifted. After D-Day, the Allied armies faced heavily fortified German positions across France and into the Reich. Every captured village and every defended river crossing meant fierce house-to-house fighting. The conventional assaults required to break the Germans' defenses were simply too costly in human lives. The Allied High Command could not continue trading hundreds or thousands of men for every mile gained. This grim situation created an urgent defining need, a means to fool German intelligence into misdirecting their reserves and delaying counterattacks long enough to give the real combat divisions the advantage of surprise. The German Wehrmacht had to be convinced to commit their tanks and artillery to a non-existent threat. The Ghost Army, a name earned by their ability to appear and disappear in the dead of night, was the genius solution. They employed four primary techniques: inflatable decoys, radio misinformation, staged physical movements, and sonic deception with massive sound truck speakers playing recordings of tank traffic. They used these artistic skills to mimic the sight, sound, and radio signature of 30,000 men with only 1,100 personnel. They successfully staged over 20 full-scale battlefield deceptions across Europe, systematically confusing the German High Command and saving countless lives in the process. This concept of fighting a war with props and sound effects was not a spontaneous battlefield inspiration. It was a radical, calculated decision from military high command. The unit was formally activated on January 20th, 1944, just as Allied forces were finalizing plans for the invasion of France. The Ghost Army was the brainchild of two military visionaries, Colonel Billy Harris and Major Ralph Ingersoll. These were not traditional infantry commanders, but military planners who were profoundly convinced that psychological operations and large-scale, strategic deception were the key to saving lives on the impending European front. Harris and Ingersoll had intensely studied German doctrine tactically, recognizing that the Wehrmacht was highly methodical, carefully recording intelligence gathered from air reconnaissance, ground patrols, and, most critically, radio communications. They theorized that if they could systematically poison the enemy's intelligence stream, they could control the deployment of entire German armored divisions. Deception, they argued, was a non-lethal weapon that could neutralize battalions without firing a shot. The elegant, necessary solution to the strategic challenge posed by conventional assaults that were proving too costly in human lives. The establishment of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was exactly the operational performance of this groundbreaking philosophy. The core of their strength was their roster, a collection of men with artistic skills considered non-essential in a typical combat environment. They recruited designers, architects, painters, and sound engineers, creating a force whose expertise lay in illusion and misdirection. Their unique purpose was to perform the military match of a massive, mobile, theatrical production. This unit's covert war of wits against the German High Command became one of the greatest and longest-held secrets of the Second World War. The success of the Ghost Army was rooted in one revolutionary shift in military thinking. It was the idea of fighting fire with creativity. Hence, the recruitment process was entirely deliberate. They went all out seeking individuals with high IQs and highly specialized creative skills. The Army didn't want men who could follow orders, but men who could convincingly stage an entire division. This mission required a blend of technical expertise and artistic imagination, and the unit was structured into four highly specialized subunits, each responsible for a distinct layer of the illusion. The first were the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. This group was the core of the artistry. They were the painters and sculptors who created the visual spectacle. Their primary tools were the inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and jeeps. They had to position these decoys realistically, paint convincing unit markings, and even fabricate the appearance of a large, busy camp, complete with staged troop movements and campfires. The second unit was the 3132nd Signal Service Company. These were the radio actors and communicators. Their job was to create a false but believable radio signature for the fictional divisions. They carefully mimicked the unique sending styles of actual operators from the real divisions, transmitting coded messages and chatter to make German radio intelligence believe a massive army was present and operational. And then, the Signal Company Special. This unit was the sound effects crew, responsible for convincing the enemy's ears. They used massive, powerful truck-mounted speaker systems to broadcast pre-recorded sound effects. These recordings included the heavy, low-frequency rumble of a 30-ton Sherman tank convoy, the roar of engineer trucks, and the clanking of bridging equipment, all played at a volume that could carry for miles across the battlefield. Finally, and importantly, the 406th Combat Engineers. These were the military backbone of the unit. They ensured the security of the highly secret operation, set up the communication centers, and assisted in the complex logistical work of moving and deploying all the inflatable gear and sound equipment across the European landscape in the dead of night. This unique, multidisciplinary structure allowed the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops to execute complete, realistic military illusions, convincing the German High Command that they were facing an overwhelming force, when in reality, they were facing a few hundred creative men and a lot of air. But the Ghost Army didn't rely on a single trick. Their power came from layering one illusion over another until the enemy could no longer tell where reality ended and performance began. There was the art of sight. The 603rd went beyond setting up decoys. They crafted an entire artificial landscape. The inflatable tanks, jeeps, and artillery were light as canvas and convincing from the sky, but were inflated in minutes and arranged with the precision of real armored battalions. The trick was subtlety. The camouflage was intentionally imperfect, just visible enough to catch the eye of enemy reconnaissance and sell the lie. Then came the manipulation of sound. The Signal Company Special handled the battlefield soundtrack. From enormous speaker trucks, they blasted recordings engineered at Bell Labs. Sherman tanks grinding over earth, engines revving, bridges clanking, battalions rolling forward. They were carefully mixed, timed, and projected to mimic the presence of thousands of troops that existed only on tape. Next was the illusion of communication. The 3132nd Signal Service Company fabricated entire radio networks out of thin air. They borrowed the sending quirks and rhythm of real operators from real divisions, building a believable stream of coded chatter. To German intelligence, these transmissions looked and sounded like a major headquarters coordinating its forces, when in truth, only a handful of highly trained radio actors were behind it. And finally, there was the human performance. The men of the 23rd became chameleons. They wore the patches of units that weren't actually there, repainted their vehicles with false markings, and wandered through cafes, truck stops, and staging areas, loudly discussing troop movements that never existed. These casual conversations, overheard by the enemy's informants, were part of the show. To execute this revolutionary strategy under the stress of combat, the soldiers of the 23rd had to undergo an intense, unorthodox preparation, a dress rehearsal for the biggest performance of the war. Their training began in the United States, first at Camp Forest in Tennessee, and later continued in the English countryside, where they perfected the coordination of visual, sonic, and radio deception in a unified sensory assault. The training itself was a constant series of field experiments. They would frequently conduct trials near major American military installations, staging a complete phantom operation where the real divisions were billeted nearby, specifically to test the realism of their illusions. The goal was practical. If they could successfully fool their own battle-hardened American comrades, they stood an excellent chance of fooling the highly disciplined German intelligence apparatus. The visual artists of the 603rd practiced the art of speed sculpting, learning how to position a convoy of decoy tanks in minutes, arranging them to hide their lack of depth from aerial view, and then dissolving the entire operation into thin air before dawn. Meanwhile, the signalmen hammered away at their keys, rigorously training to mimic the fist and identifiable rhythm of a real radio operator until their false transmissions were indistinguishable from the authentic chatter of a major command. And the same standard applied to the other two units as well. This rehearsal process ensured that when the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops finally deployed to the European mainland, every movement, every sound, and every coded message was part of a perfectly choreographed sequence. They were synchronized, ready for the biggest, highest stakes theatrical performance in history, one where the audience was the German army, and the cost of failure was thousands of American lives. Once their training was complete, the Ghost Army was ready to move from rehearsal to the field, to deploy their techniques in the brutal environment of the European theater. Their initial missions were vital to protecting the vulnerable Allied position. One of their first assignments was Operation Vendetta, launched just as the Allies were expanding the Normandy beachheads. The goal was to shield the actual troops by drawing enemy attention elsewhere. The 23rd simulated the presence of a completely different, massive force preparing to strike further up the coast. By fabricating radio traffic and staging brief visual shows, they succeeded in confusing the German High Command about the true scale and location of the invasion. Their most famous early mission, however, was Operation Brest. The Allied objective was the fortified French port of Brest, held by the tenacious German commander, General Hermann Bernhard Ramke. Rather than risk a devastating frontal assault, the Ghost Army was brought in. The unit simulated a massive American unit, a full armored division preparing for an imminent, overwhelming attack on the port. This was one of the first critical operations where all the elements of deception were used together in flawless coordination. The illusion was so convincing that General Ramke was entirely fooled. Convinced he was facing overwhelming, immediate annihilation, the German general was successfully persuaded to pull forces away from key defensive positions or, in some accounts, expedite his surrender. The deception successfully tied down and neutralized thousands of veteran German troops without the sacrifice of a single American combat division. The Ghost Army had proven its worth. A few artists could achieve what weeks of bloody fighting could not. As the war entered its final, frenzied stage, the Ghost Army was called upon to intervene in one of the war's most desperate moments. It was the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When the Germans launched their massive, surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the overwhelmed, thinly spread American lines and the confusion across the entire front was absolute. The Ghost Army's primary role during this chaos was to actively confuse the enemy about the composition and positioning of the hastily retreating and repositioning American forces. Their radio deception was particularly vital, as they worked around the clock to create a fog of misinformation, preventing German intelligence from determining which American units had been destroyed and where the critical reinforcement lines were being established. This ensured that the German High Command could never gain a clear picture of the broken but rebuilding Allied front. Following the main battle, the unit was immediately redeployed for Operation Bogus near Luxembourg. The goal was to protect the crucial flank of Patton's Third Army as it drove north. The 23rd was tasked with simulating the presence of a full armored division, the 6th Armored Division, to hold a position against potential counterattacks from elite German panzer units. Operating with extreme urgency and peril, the unit deployed its entire arsenal of deception elements, creating a realistic staging area, complete with inflated armor, loud sonic transmissions of a massive force moving into position, and convincing radio chatter. This elaborate ruse successfully delayed the movement of real German panzer units by several critical days. Throughout the chaos of the Bulge and the subsequent operations, the soldiers of the 23rd were frequently required to operate dangerously close to the front lines. They had to work in full view of enemy forward observers, and, in some cases, were positioned directly in the path of anticipated German advances. Their survival depended entirely on the quality of their illusion. If the Germans had ever discovered the deception, the consequences for the artists with their rubber tanks would have been immediate and lethal. Yet, they held the line, using art to achieve a strategic victory that few combat units could have matched. Their small victories and their near misses all topped off in their final and most crucial mission, Operation Viersen. This operation was the defining moment for the Ghost Army, a deception designed to clear the path for the largest, most critical river crossing of the entire European campaign. The real crossing, Operation Plunder, was scheduled for late March 1945, hundreds of miles away. The Ghost Army's objective was to draw the full, vengeful attention of the German High Command to Viersen, a different, less advantageous section of the Rhine. The scale of the illusion was immense, and for the men of the 23rd, the risk was absolute. They were forced to operate directly on the riverbank, placing themselves in a kill zone. The risk of detection from German patrols and reconnaissance was constant, and the area was regularly subjected to retaliatory mortar fire. Yet, the performance had to be continuous. For a grueling 48 hours, the artists and engineers worked without rest to maintain the fictional staging. The physical labor was exhausting. Hundreds of lightweight, inflatable rubber vehicles had to be constantly checked, repositioned, and even repaired to maintain the appearance of an active, bustling armored camp. Under the perpetual threat of bombardment, the men had to ensure the fake tank tracks were deep in the mud and that the camouflage nets appeared appropriately careless. Meanwhile, the coordination of the radio and sonic deception was flawless, creating a complete, non-stop narrative of an army building up for a massive assault. The air was thick with the continuous, heavy growl of engines from the speaker trucks, seamlessly blending with the authentic-sounding radio chatter from the 3102nd. They had to tell a continuous, believable story to the enemy's senses, hour after hour, until the real U.S. Ninth Army launched Operation Plunder far away. When the real attack commenced, the German reserves, their heavy artillery, and their panzer divisions were all lined up, sights zeroed in on Viersen, the Phantom Army. The deception was a resounding success. Operation Viersen was the Ghost Army's largest deception, and by saving untold American lives at the Rhine, this act of mass illusion was the unit's defining moment, proving that in war, perception can truly be mightier than the sword. The success provided proof of the Ghost Army's value. Their 48-hour performance along the Rhine River was a masterpiece of strategic deception that secured one of the greatest bloodless victories of the war. The pressure applied by the simulated force was huge. German intelligence fully accepted the decoy position at Viersen as the actual target of the 9th U.S. Army's decisive attack. Operating on the flawed intelligence fed to them by the 23rd's rubber tanks and continuous radio chatter, the German High Command made the fatal strategic error. They diverted their best panzer divisions, heaviest armor, and concentrated artillery away from the true crossing site and held their fire, waiting in ambush at the simulated location. Meanwhile, just as the Ghost Army was dissolving into the night mist, the real 9th U.S. Army was executing Operation Plunder elsewhere. Because the enemy's reserves and artillery were entirely misplaced, the 9th Army crossed the massive Rhine River with minimal initial resistance. This direct, the minimal resistance encountered at the actual crossing point versus the heavy forces tied up at Viersen, was directly attributed to the deception. Historians and military analysts estimate that by successfully fooling the German High Command and misdirecting their forces at this critical stage of the war, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were responsible for saving an estimated 10,000 to 40,000 American lives. The ultimate victory of the Ghost Army's final mission, Operation Viersen, should have made them heroes. Instead, it sentenced them to silence. In the immediate post-war period, the unit's very existence was instantly classified as top secret. The soldiers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were ordered to pack up their inflatable tanks and sound trucks and return home. But they were also legally forbidden from speaking about the war they had actually fought. Their oaths of secrecy were absolute, punishable by court-martial. These men, who had saved entire divisions, engineers who had fooled the German High Command, could not claim credit for their life-saving work. They could not share their stories of daring creativity with their families, or even the Department of Veterans Affairs. They were combat veterans who had earned the respect of the entire Allied command structure, yet they had to live as if they had done nothing more than fill out paperwork for 3 years. For over 4 decades, their incredible history remained locked away in classified archives. It was not until 1996 that the veil of secrecy was finally lifted, and the documents detailing their heroic acts of deception were declassified. The artists of the Ghost Army could finally talk. The oath of silence cast a long shadow, forcing the veterans of the 23rd to tuck away their incredible war stories. Yet, the same high intelligence and boundless creativity that made the masters of deception define their return to civilian life, profoundly shaping American culture. Their ability to look at an object and see its potential for transformation were simply applied to a new canvas. The unit's training in visual and atmospheric deception fundamentally shaped their artistic perspective. They had spent years studying the way light, shadow, and positioning create reality, and that insight became the foundation for their post-war careers. Ellsworth Kelly, returned to become one of the most significant abstract painters of the 20th century. His minimalist focus on pure color, form, and composition was directly informed by his time crafting massive, minimalist illusions in the field. The legendary American fashion designer, Bill Blass, also applied his wartime training in visual presentation and subtle manipulation of appearance to high fashion. The same eye for detail and perception management that made a rubber tank look real made his clothing lines look timeless and effortless. Then the brilliant photographer, Art Kane. He captured some of the most iconic moments in music and culture, including the famous 1958 photograph, A Great Day in Harlem, featuring 57 jazz legends. His ability to stage and capture complex scenes, arranging dozens of subjects to create a singular, powerful visual narrative, was a direct continuation of his work managing battlefield illusions. The declassification marked the beginning of their long fight for official recognition. The veterans and their families spent years advocating for the recognition that their bloodless victories deserved. That fight finally reached its conclusion decades later. In 2024, the U.S. Congress formally recognized their indispensable service, and the surviving members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops finally received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor bestowed by Congress. It was a long overdue final salute to the soldiers who proved that imagination was, indeed, the most powerful weapon of them all. The story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops redefined military success. Their greatest victories were not measured in miles gained or enemies killed, but in lives saved, a fact attributed to their psychological mastery of the battlefield, demonstrating that strategic success often depends not on how much force you possess, but on how much force the enemy believes you possess. The legacy of the 23rd is a powerful testament to the value of unconventional genius. The men who were initially deemed unsuitable for combat, the artists, the actors, the designers, became the architects of victory. They had the courage to apply highly unconventional solutions to save the lives of those who fought conventionally. If you found this exploration fascinating, you are going to like our video about how one janitor's accidental floor wax trick defeated a German spy ring in 48 hours. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history where art and action collide.